History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Nancy Mastro, author of the novel Solitary Walker, a novel of Mary Wollstonecraft.
Thanks for having me, Colin. This is really exciting to visit with you.
Sorry, I forgot to just say welcome, so I'll do that again.
Okay, sounds good.
Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Nancy Mastro, author of the novel Solitary Walker, a novel of Mary Wollstonecraft. Nancy, hello.
Thank you. Hello to you as well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with Mary, the central figure of this biographical fictional novel. What inspired you to write a novel about her?
Oh, so many things. The first and foremost, I think, is that I enjoy reading biographical novels. They are far and away my favorite. And knowing that these stories are about real people is really interesting to me. And so that was the first thing I knew I wanted to write about. And then so the question was, well, who? And I initially thought I might write about Mary Shelley. But the more I researched Mary Shelley, the more I became aware of and familiar with her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. And it was Mary who really captured my imagination. And so it's her story that I wanted to tell.
And when you were doing that process, what inspired you about Mary, but also what did you see that was kind of missing from what has already been written about her?
Well, it's surprising, but very few, when I started this 6 years ago, very few historical novels had been written about Mary. I could only find one, and it was a very obscure novel that no one knew about, and I couldn't even find a copy of. So that sounded like a pretty good deal to me. I would be the first one to write a novel about her. Well, um, about 3 years in to my writing, lo and behold, a novel came out about Mary Wollstonecraft. And it was very good. And it kind of took the wind out of my sails a little bit. But I thought, well, there's more than one book out there about George Washington, and Mary Wollstonecraft is as important a figure. And so I trudged on. And then a couple of years later, another novel about Mary came out. And so now there are two others out there, and heaven knows how many more. I don't know, but only two that I am aware of. But my story is different than the story each of those two very good authors tell. And I really zero in on Mary's rise as a writer and as a philosopher, and her sometimes disastrous forays into romance. She was a sworn spinster, and of course, love has a way of catching up with people, and so it did with Mary as well. And the other thing I think is that when I talk to other women, um, so many don't know who Mary is, and Mary's prominence in as a historical figure is really quite significant. But I think she certainly hasn't been overlooked by history, but she maybe has not been as well known in popular culture. And so I really felt there was a story to tell to put Mary in the hands of just the average person so that they could know about this woman who paved so many roads for women. It's really quite incredible the ground that she laid for many years to come, actually, and is still quite prominent in the news.
Well, the circumstances of human rights, of women rights, are always changing. Where were they at in Mary's time, and what circumstances was she in that allowed her to kind of recognize those shortcomings and speak out for them?
That is really such a great question. She grew up in and lived during the Georgian era. She was born in 1759, and so she is that 18th century figure. And she grew up in a gentleman's home. Her father was a gentleman, but He was an abusive man, and he squandered the family fortune. And Mary saw the disaster that her mother became as a result of that very dysfunctional relationship, and she really wanted to make her own way in the world, and that included not being married to anyone. And of course, at that time, jobs were fairly non-existent for women. They certainly were for the lower classes, certainly not for a middle class young woman. And so she saw these limitations that surrounded her. And she said, that's really not okay. And being an outspoken, self-educated, largely self-educated young woman, she challenged the status quo, and she found a voice that luckily was picked up by a prominent publisher in London. And that really started her writing career.
What were you able to learn about her personally, and how were you able to convey that personality on the page?
Right. Well, fortunately for this researcher, there are a lot of biographies about Mary. And so I had a lot of material to work with. There are several volumes of her letters and her writings, of course. So I had a lot of material to work with, as well as a memoir that her husband wrote about her. So the information was easily attainable. So the next question becomes then, how do I portray that to a modern reader so that they could appreciate the position that Mary was in this very restrictive society, and appreciate how difficult it was for her to even be heard, and to tell that story in a compelling way that had the right amount of tension and conflict in it, and stay true to the history, which is personally very important to me in a biographical novel, to stay true to the facts, um, and yet not have it turn out to be a 2,000-page novel, right? And so I really zeroed in on who Mary was, as I said, as a writer, what compelled her to write, what inspired her thoughts. The injustices around her certainly inspired her. The limited role for women. Women were basically the property of their husbands. They had no rights whatsoever. And that just didn't sit well with her. So I try to bring that voice, that spirited voice through. And then it was really important to me to present alongside of that Mary the woman, the woman with her flaws, with her shortcomings, a woman of contradictions at times. Mary, I would describe as a very smart woman who sometimes did stupid things. But we as modern women, I think, can even appreciate how we do the best we can, but sometimes we get tripped up in our own short-sightedness and in our own fears. And of course, Mary, growing up in a very abusive home, she had some personality traits, or some character traits that really created some blinders for her that she had to work through, like everybody has to work through. But I did want her to come across as human, as a real woman, not a monolithic figure that was perfect. As I said, she was very flawed in many ways, but yet she is so to be admired for how she simply broke through all of the things that were working against her, and she found a way through, and she did it her way.
You mentioned earlier that Mary Wollstonecraft didn't really break into pop culture, but her daughter certainly did, with Frankenstein. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how, if and how Mary Wollstonecraft changed once she had a daughter, and how her life inspired what Mary Shelley was able to do?
Right. And so, to answer that question, it's going to give away a few spoilers, but Mary's story is out there, right? And she Mary dies giving birth. Mary Wollstonecraft dies giving birth to Mary Shelley. So Mary Shelley never knew her mother, but she was extremely inspired by her because of her mother's writing, because of her father's absolute love and adoration for Mary Wollstonecraft. Um, so the question I think was what how did being a mother change Mary? She had a daughter before Mary Shelley as well. And being a mother, I think for Mary showed her, on the one hand, how difficult it was to do as a single woman, just much like it's difficult today as a single mom. And she also had to learn how to still be herself amidst uh, maybe judgments made toward her, how she still strived to live a life of independence when the rest of society wanted to um, hold her in disdain. She had to really work against a lot of those societal barriers as well as those moral barriers that were in place at the time. So I think it was pretty tough for Mary Wollstonecraft. And when she became a mother, I think it just added to her determination to not let that part keep her from living the life she envisioned for herself. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying not to, like I said, give away too
Sure.
much of the story, but anybody can Google Mary and know what happens.
Well, you've talked about some of the difficult challenges for women of that time, but the work you do in bringing out women's stories, I think resonates even today. And I read, it must have been on your website, that you say that subtle and not so subtle cultural and educational and societal undercurrents undermine women's confidence. Can you talk about what that means and how that's still prevalent in today's world?
Right. Oh, sure. Even today, a woman who stands out as being different will often be criticized. You can even have someone like Taylor Swift, as famous as she is, and people will find things to pick at about her. She'll have her supporters as well as her detractors. So even today, when women have supposedly all of these rights, and we do, compared to what Mary Wollstonecraft had in her day, we have gained a great deal in terms of opportunity. But things like the glass ceiling still exist. Attitudes towards women in leadership are still negative as compared to men in leadership. There's documented evidence of that still. People like Sheryl Sandberg, who was the this, I think the CEO of Facebook when she wrote the book Lean In, and saying, we're not there yet. And people sort of take for granted that women can do whatever they want. And really the barriers are still there. A lot of times they're invisible. Um, a couple of writers have something they call the confidence code, and they talk about how women's attitudes towards themselves can be negatively affected by popular culture, whether it's the emphasis on beauty, the emphasis on a certain body image, and so on. And girls are still expected to be nice and to play nice. And so, and it's well known that in middle schools, girls sort of start to hide their um, their academic excellence because it's not cool. And so there's a long list of things in that regard. And I think it just shows even, not to go political, but even in the last presidential election, we really saw some gender differentiating going on. there. So it'll be interesting to see. Women are losing some of the rights they've taken for granted. Abortion rights is one example. Again, not to be political, but these are things that are happening in modern society, and some fear that we may be going backward in terms of what women have been able to achieve. And I grew up in the 70s when things like Title IX and the Equal Rights Amendment were still, they were big things at the time. And I'm appreciative for all the doors that, those activities of women opened. But I think there are more doors to open.
Well, let's talk a little bit about you. Tell me about your journey as a writer and maybe some of the challenges of writing a fiction novel that you weren't prepared for when you started.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things. And so, as a working professional, I was an educator. I was in school administration, and finished out my career as a school superintendent. And those jobs just sort of eat up your time and your energy. And but I would do some dabbling on the side with creative writing and so on. But I knew it wouldn't be until I retired from my professional career that I would really be able to have the time to devote to writing that I did. And so that really was my goal when I retired, was to write a novel and to write other things like my blog and so on. And so that's been a lot of fun as a writer. I thought, well, should I go to college and get my MFA? And I thought, no, I don't need another degree. What I need to know is how to write. And so I set up more of a personalized learning journey by taking classes and connecting with other writers, joining writing associations, reading craft books, all of those things to learn what I could. So really kind of navigating through that writing process, and then hired a developmental editor right away when I started writing, so that I had that support along the way. And some of the things that I learned is that, writing is hard work. I never for a minute thought that it wasn't. But there are so many things that the reader doesn't have to think about that the writer has to know and to bring in gently into that narrative. So it was learning those nuances. And for historical novels, the research part was very lengthy. That's why it took me 6 years to get from start to when the publication comes out. And of course, publishing too is very timely. Once your book's accepted by a publisher, it takes a long time to get to market. Um, but for me, as I said earlier, it's very important to stay true to the history. And so I wanted a narrative that was accurate, but it had to appeal to readers too. And so the story really had to come first. The history had to come second. The story has to come first. And so tweaking that out, I made a huge rookie mistake. I literally wrote two books in my first draft. I have 200,000 words, and nobody's going to publish 200,000 words for a rookie author, right? So I really had to take all of that and I had to condense that into a more manageable size story. And so I took Mary's whole life and I truncated my novel to basically 10 years of her life, which is, as I said, the writing part. And then when she dips that toe into to the story of her loves of her life, if you will.
And what was the submission process like for you? How long did it take? And also, when you did find a publisher, Black Rose Writing, uh,
Hmm.
what have they been like to work with? What is their mission?
Sure. And so I really started like everybody does. You think, well, maybe I'll try to get an agent. And I did have agents who were interested. But as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, while I was writing this, two other books about Mary came out. And one agent said, I do really like this, but she said, I just don't think I can sell this right now. And so I thought, well, I have to take that as a word of advice. And so then I did some tweaks with the story, and then I started approaching small publishers because I think small publishers aren't quite as difficult to get the attention of as maybe the big five, because the big five right now, what we see and what we hear and what we read is that they are really playing it safe. They are sticking with authors who have a track record, and for new novelists to break in is really quite difficult. Um, and also my age, I'm retired. If I was 40 years old or even 45, I think I would maybe, continue to seek to have agent representation and so on. But I'm not. I'm at a different stage in life than that. And so when I shifted over to small publishers, I had offers quite quickly and landed with Black Rose Writing, and primarily because I knew I had met the publisher at a conference, and I knew several people who had published books with Black Rose, and they spoke really well of them. And those are the kinds of things you want to hear. I did have an experience of an author friend who had worked with a small publisher, and her that publishing house folded in the middle of production. And I was worried about that. So I wanted a publisher who had a track record, and was really on the rise as a book publishing company. And I think Black Rose Writing is. I think it's very well managed, and they're in a growth mode.
Well, that's great that you were able to find
Mhm.
that partner.
Yeah.
Well, lastly, if you could just tell us a little bit about Her Story Revisited, what
Yeah.
can readers find there?
Right. So Her Story Revisited is my blog that I publish on my website. Thinking about moving over to Substack, but it will be housed in both places. But in it, I review biographical novels about what I call audacious women from history, and these are the books that take what we know about these women who did so much to change the landscape for women, and they're telling their story through that creative novel form. And I like telling readers about those novels. And I don't spend a lot of time reviewing the book because there's a lot of places they can find reviews, whether it's Goodreads or any number of things, BookBub and the like. But I go into a little bit. So who really was that woman, and what's behind her story? So I go a little bit into the biographical information, so that they're getting a teaser with the novel, but then what do we know about this woman, and trying to do it in a way where I'm not giving away the novel, but really taking readers into history so that people know about these wonderful women. That's really what that blog is aimed to do. And I have a lot of fun writing it, I'll tell you. It's such a nice shift, if you will, from the drafting and the editing of your novel to writing something that is more I don't want to say nonfiction, but it's different than writing your novel work, right? You
Mhm.
have a different audience and it has a different purpose. And I do like that variety.
Well, when I was looking at it, I found your blog about The Lost Wife, and that's
Oh,
about Sarah
yes.
Wakefield and the U.S. Dakota War. And, I write novels about the U.S. Dakota War, so I immediately took an interest in that. And I was
Yes.
not familiar with the novel. Looks like it was published early last year. And you did a really great job of summing up the history because you really went into the historical context of everything going on with the war there. So I found it very, very interesting, and it introduced me to a novel I did not know about.
See, and there you go. That's exactly what my goal is, to, really that literary citizenship of sharing good books. And I that is an awesome book. Um, don't miss that one. I think you'd really like it. Absolutely.
Well, Nancy, congratulations on Solitary Walker, and thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you as well. I enjoyed this conversation. Who doesn't like talking about books, right? Whether they're your own or somebody else's.